landed in Canada. So there's no patient here. There's some that are being tested, but there is no patient here. So therefore, that particular virus is not in Canada. So if you have cold symptoms right now, it's either a cold or the flu. The flu would be like a Mack truck where it feels like you were fine, and then it feels like something toppled you over. That would be the flu-like symptoms. Whereas the cold is a very slow, progressive, runny nose, kind of slow, sluggish kind of thing. And just remember that nobody has this fancy coronavirus right now, so therefore you're not at risk.
But if they happen to coronavirus, or if it makes itself known in this country, yes, what treatment options are there?
So there's no treatment options, unfortunately. So we don't have a direct treatment against the coronavirus. So it's all supportive therapy. So that's why they quarantine the people, they get them into hospital, and it's supportive, meaning they can't breathe, we give them oxygen, they can't drink, we give them fluids, their kidneys shut down, we help them. And really what we're doing is we're waiting for the body's own immune system to fight it off. So basically what happens, your army, your immune system comes and fights with whatever it has. Very quickly it says, I need to build a special weapon. We call those antibodies. So basically the antibodies can recognize those spikes. So the antibody grabs a hold of the spikes and then it gets rid of the virus. So that's why 3-4 days later, people start getting better from a normal cold because the antibodies have been made. Unfortunately with SARS, it was so fast that it killed people before you can. So that's why it was a bit lethal. And here we're seeing some similarities in that situation. Also, the elderly, their immune system is not so good. Mm-hmm. So therefore, they might not make it and then make those antibodies. And then finally, these things came across from an animal. So it's quite new. So our immune system, they don't recognize it, and that causes further delay.
Okay, I'm going to get you to hold there, but we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Peter Lin online, so you can watch on our Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter pages. Post your questions. Matthew, we have your first question. We'll begin that in a few seconds. Stay with us. So if you're watching CBC News Network, you saw we had begun our conversation with Dr. Peter Lin, CBC News' medical contributor, about the coronavirus that we're tracking out of Wuhan. We're now joining and continuing our conversation on our social media pages, the CBC News Facebook page, as well as the YouTube page and Twitter page. So by all means, ask your questions. We're going to continue our conversation. Dr. Lin, so you mentioned SARS in your last question. Let's make a distinction here. What makes this coronavirus different from what we saw in SARS? Because certainly in the early days, that was the comparison, a SARS-like coronavirus coming out of China.
So it's in the same family, so it's a coronavirus family, and corona just means crown. So when you look at these viruses, they all have these little spikes going across the top. So the differences are the spikes and how easy is it to transmit and how deadly is it. In other words, how fast does it grow, and therefore how fast does it destroy your lung cells. So therefore transmissibility is what we're looking for. Now in this particular case, it's a unique feature. So when they found the virus, they sort of did the DNA or the RNA coding, so they know the mapping, and it looks different than SARS. So that's why they say it's a new virus that's coming out. Again, because our body won't be able to recognize it. So now they're saying, how many people does it kill? But that needs to know the bottom number, like how many people are infected. So right now they're saying, let's say 1,300 people confirmed. That means that they had the test, they were sick enough to come into hospital. But you can imagine there are many people that may not have gone to hospital that have sickness, they're at home. So we don't know what the bottom number is. We know that 41 people died, but then we don't know how lethal it is at the current moment. And we don't know how fast it transmits to people because we can't track every single person that is sitting there in Wuhan.
I think that leads us to Ryan Hammond, who's on YouTube, because he wants this question answered. How did this virus even become a thing? Where did it come from?
So coronaviruses predominantly live in animals, okay? So bats and cats and dogs and camels and snakes and all that kind of stuff. So they like living in there. Now, because in China, there's this market where there might be live animals being sold, you now have people coming into close contact with the animals. And so therefore the virus is made in the animal and then it crosses over. Now, you do need some mutation mutation for it to get into our lungs and then attach. Because if you don't have the right key, our body is not going to allow it to attach. So some sort of mutation happened. Now this thing crosses across to people. Now the hope was it would just stop there. In other words, animal to people, and then that's it. But then we started seeing healthcare workers getting sick, family members getting sick. Those people never saw the animals. And that's when they realized that it's now going from one person to the next. And what they're going to look for is super spreaders. So if they see a person that infects many people, then they have to worry, did the virus mutate again? So now it's very easy to go from one person to the next. So these are all the things that they're tracking. And then they can get the samples and then test, has this thing changed 31st? And if it has changed, is it more lethal? Is it easier to transmit? That's what they're tracking right now.
Mm-hmm. You know, you and I were talking in the back before we came on air. And what I found interesting was that if one of us was, for example, a carrier, one would not have to necessarily sneeze into another person's face. You could sneeze, for example, on a table and still catch the virus on a table.
Right, because the key thing is that the virus needs us to move it into your lungs. So for example, if I sneeze and you breathe that air, that's the easiest way to get in. Because the virus really has no wings and no feet. It requires us to do the job. So let's say I sneeze, and then now the particles settle out on this table. So you come along, you touch the table, you have the virus on your hands. So that's why people are saying don't bring your hands to your face, because then there's a chance that the virus can be breathed in. Remember, it has to get to your lungs to attach, because that's the only key that it has. So that's why we tell people no hands to face. Somebody's sneezing, stay away, so that way you're not breathing in that stuff. The other one, I know that everybody teaches, cough, sneeze into your elbow. I never quite understood that, because now you have millions of viruses in your elbow. And what do you and I do? So I'm talking to you, I go, Michael, okay, this is, and I put my hand on here, and then I shake your hand, and now I've passed it. So sneeze into a Kleenex, get rid of that. And so those are the most common places. The other one is the floor, because a lot of particles end up on the floor, and we have backpacks and bags that we put on the floor. You pick up the backpack, you touch the bottom, and again, if you can remember anything, no hands to face, and that would be helpful. Those simple masks that we're using, one of the reasons why they work is because it stops me from touching my face, and so therefore the virus doesn't have the portal to get into your body.
Okay. And that leads me to another one. This is from Nicopolis Catherine on Facebook, and she asked the following: will this affect imported foods? There's been many food contaminations infected with illnesses lately. Is this a case where food that comes to us from Asia might be suspect?
Yeah, so the key thing is majority no, because when you eat the virus, the good news, you have acid in your stomach, it will destroy this particular virus. And remember, it only has the special key, the docking spike for your lungs. So that's why the virus really needs to get into your lungs. So therefore, if let's say it was from chickens from before, the chicken meat itself won't have anything. And so the idea is that you would have to breathe it in from a live animal. And so that's why in those markets in China, that's where, and by the way, it's illegal, but yet it continues on. And so that's why breathing it in is so important. Whereas if you ate the meat from it, it wouldn't actually affect you.
Okay, let's bring in another clip here. As I said, we went to the streets of Toronto, asked some people what they were thinking about their questions. Take a listen to this question. And this has to do with the information that we're actually getting from Beijing. Take a listen.
I've heard that certain Chinese citizens are saying that the government are misreporting the actual cases, how many cases there really are. So I guess I would ask a doctor, how much can you trust the data that's coming out?
What would you say to that?
That's a good question, and that's what happened in SARS, 20 years ago. Basically, it was information that wasn't shared. Now, initially, the World Health Organization is saying that China has been sharing, which is true, because right away, we've now got the gene of this thing. We've mapped the whole thing out, which means that they identified it and they talked about it. In terms of the numbers, part of it may be that they don't want to report the information. Part of it also might be the information is changing so quickly. As you and I have looked at, one day it's 8 people, the next day it's 17, the next day it's 41. You keep turning around, and the number of deaths are quite high. And they're also running out of supplies. In other words, that special fast test to check for this virus, they're running out. So if they don't have it, they can't label that person as having the virus. However, there are reports sort of on social media that I can't confirm, but doctors are saying there's huge lineups at the hospital. They're running out of supplies, masks and things like that, because if you lock down a city, your transportation system, you can't bring in all the goods as well. So therefore, the next sort of crisis that we have to manage will be what happens during these lockdowns in these these cities, are we going to get the medicines that we need, the masks and all those other things to the right places? And can we take care of these people? And that's why when I heard that they're building 2 hospitals that are 1,300 people, it means that the problem is quite big. So for example, initially we kept saying it was a couple of hundred people.
Yeah.
If it's a couple of hundred people, I don't need to build a new hospital. I could absorb that. But the fact that they're building 2 complete hospitals there means that the numbers are very large on the ground. So we may be missing some of the people. And for sure, there are sick enough to go into hospital that have the virus that may be now spreading this virus further out.
So could this be a tip of looking at here?
Yes, very much so. And the worry is that when that iceberg tips, in other words, like a tipping point, right? There's a point at which you just can't contain people, right? So the was in that wet market, during that time. But the problem is the person got sick. They don't get sick right away. There's an incubation period. So maybe he got exposed today, but won't show symptoms for 4 or 5 days. So all the people around that time would have spread out already. So trying to contain it at that point was already difficult. But now imagine trying to contain it as people move to Shanghai and Beijing and things like that, and trying to shut down transportation now becomes very difficult. And it does cause some panic in people because they're not sure, is it just floating around the air? By the way, it is not floating around in the air. So those droplets will settle out. So it's not like you're walking in a deserted area and you're going to breathe. Not that kind of virus.
Okay, not that type of virus. Although you mentioned masks, and I want to bring in a question here that we got from someone on Twitter who goes by Noyo. Are those masks actually effective?
Right. They're leaking on the side. So when we were given the SARS mask, that was the N95. Those ones, the ones that you have to get fitted, you have to shave, and then it seals around you, and you're truly breathing through a filter. And it's horribly difficult to breathe. Like you get dizzy trying to breathe through this thing. The ones that we have, the paper one that you see everybody wearing, really it leaks all over the place. So if somebody sneezed directly at you, it's better than not having a mask, but certainly there's going to be a cloud around you. But what it's you from touching your face. And by stopping that, then you won't bring viruses from things that you've touched onto your face. The other thing that I want to tell people is that if it gets wet, so in other words, you have some, moisture, now that filter is no longer worthwhile. So you have to get rid of it. Because I've been seeing people using the same mask over and over again, and some people are using just the cloth one. That and it's full of moisture, it'll grow mold. So that would make you sick faster than the coronavirus, for example, here in Canada, where there's no virus. That would actually make people sick as well.
Although, and correct me if I think the advice that we're hearing right now is really the masks should be used not by people who are afraid of getting sick, but those who are sick.
Correct. So the people that are sick, put the mask on, then that stops the virus spreading. Please, if you have that, cough into your Kleenex. And what we're also telling, because the news is so broad, that now everybody knows this. So if you know somebody coming back from China that gets sick, then basically those people we have to protect and then get to a healthcare facility. So the fellow that was in Washington, he landed, there was no screening, he read about this and he said, I'm one of these people coming from China. And then he reported himself to the health authorities, the doctors, but he called ahead. He said, I've been there. And so they took precautions. Nobody in the healthcare team got sick. Nobody in the family got sick. So in other words, we can manage this if we just do these simple things. It doesn't have to be this sort of horrific pandemic that everybody keeps warning about.
And offices, at least the ones around here in the GTA, which I can speak to, that when you go to a doctor's office or a hospital, there are the microbiotic lotions that you put on your hand, and they give coughing or you're sick, wear a mask. So follow those instructions.
Right, and those are very simple things. And if you've been traveling, just always call ahead and just say, I've been traveling, I'll be coming in, I'll have a mask, and so on and so forth. So in other words, if we handle these patients well, whether it's a SARS or MERS or this one or influenza, all of those things work the same because they're all viruses. They need a way to propel to the next person. So we just take these simple steps. All viruses will not transmit so easily.
Okay. Let's take a step back, though, because Matthew Chechia, I'm hoping I pronounced that correctly, Matthew, he's on Twitter and he says, what are the most common early warning signs that a person has been infected? And this almost goes to the early days of Wuhan because, they, as you said, people would have been walking around. It's just the common cold, or perhaps I'm starting the flu. Right.
So the first thing is that there's an incubation period. So this is when the virus is setting up shop. So it's sort of, putting itself into all these places. So it hasn't started the factory production yet. So during the 4 or 5 days, people feel well. They've now expanded that and said it could be up to 14 days, just to make sure that they have a big window to catch everybody. So if you've been in Wuhan over the last 14 days and you start getting any cold symptoms, then you need to report immediately. Initially, it will be simple symptoms. coughing, cold, sneezing, a bit of fever, and then quickly it'll get into this lung situation where you're destroying your lung cells, so now you can't exchange oxygen, and this is where people start feeling short of breath and end up in hospital. Our goal is never to have that situation, to find these people earlier as they land in Canada. In China, it's a different story. They don't have like a plane landing as the event. This is all over the place now, and that's why they're having difficulty containing.
Well, let's talk about that. You say if you're coming back from Wuhan, but what if you're coming back from Hong Kong? What if you're coming back from Thailand, where they've reported cases, in Japan, where they've reported cases? How wide does your frame of reference have to be before you tell a health official, by the way, I was traveling in so-and-so area?
So nowadays we tell everybody, if you've had travel in the last 2 weeks, just tell everybody. And that way, if you're well, I still tell everybody, just you're in that time frame of 2 weeks, please stay away from people. So don't go to public gatherings, don't take public transit if you can, if you're coming from the Far East area. And the reason for that is that you might be looking fine now, but we don't know what happens thereafter. The good news though, when you're looking perfectly fine, you're not really that infectious because the virus hasn't started replicating yet. It's when you start feeling any kind of achy, fever, that kind of stuff, that's when the virus is starting to turn on the factories, and that's when we have to be very careful. So I think always travel history is important. And I think we were, as doctors, we were a little complacent with it. You know, we had gotten through the SARS and the MERS and everything else. But now I think everybody is now asking about travel history, and it's in the last 2 weeks that's the most important right now.
Okay, so and we're looking right now at where cases have been detected, so people can be aware of that. There is one question here being asked, and before we actually began our social media conversation when we were on, you were talking about the elderly versus those that are younger, that are more able to create the antibodies to fight this off. But we do have a question about young children. Should I be very concerned for young kids around me, youngest being 8 months old?
Sure. So the younger children, their immune system is not as good. So therefore, if they came from the China area and then they developed fever and things like that, we'd be very concerned because their immune system is not strong enough. They tend to tip over faster. So that's why with children, we're more careful. And so if you have been in that area and you come back, we're more careful with the children to monitor them for the 2 weeks period. If on the other hand, you're in Canada, you haven't left and really haven't had contact with everybody else, coronavirus, but you might get the flu, you might get influenza, and you might get the normal colds and stuff like rhinoviruses. So therefore, we still have to be careful. And all those simple things that we talked about, washing hands, not touching, and maybe people that say, oh, isn't this baby so cute? And they come into the face, maybe let's avoid that part, right? Because now you're bringing viruses to the little baby as well.
Okay, good to know. Let's bring in another question here. Again, on the streets, this is what someone has to ask about symptoms.
If there's any symptoms beyond just having flu-like symptoms, like so that you would know what to do if you had those extra symptoms.
Yeah, I mean, that would be the great thing. It would be fantastic if you got a rash or something like that.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, no rash, because remember, it just attaches in the lung area. And so it's the very shortness of breath that people are. So what'll happen is that the course of it would be like you start feeling sick and then you go down very quickly. And in those situations, people used to say, well, I just have the flu, I'll just sit at home. In that situation, with a travel history, we don't sit at home, we get them to the facility, call ahead so that they're prepared, and then that way they will do all the proper testing and everything else. In Canada, we still have those testing kits. In Wuhan and some of these other places, they've run out of those testing kits. So now we're in a situation, flu season, cold season, and we have this virus. So how do we sort people out? So that's why they need to get more testing kits and so on and so forth in that region. And so even though it's not a major sort of emergency worldwide, but it is a very much emergency there.
Well, let's talk about that, because the World Health Organization, they were debating whether or not they need to declare this a global cause of concern, and they decided not to.
Right.
What's your reaction to that?
So a couple of things. At the moment that they were looking at it, there was 17 situation, do we need to do certain resources? And some of these emergency situations forces countries to share their information. I said, China's sharing information, they're doing all the right things. Why do we need to trigger this? Because it has economic problems once you put in one of these emergency situations. So that's why they were trying to balance. And at that time, the numbers didn't look scary. Now the number looks scarier. And with people traveling for the lunar calendar year, now we have the concern people might have sort of ignored the ban and still went off. And so the next couple of days to weeks is when we're going to see, is there a big spike?
Yeah.
And if there's a big spike, that's going to be a
And,
concern.
I think Canadians, that's what we often see at Christmas.
Yes,
People
exactly.
will still have
They'll
Christmas
still
dinner with their
go.
family if they have the flu, and they'll tell, not contagious,
That's
but
right.
they're sitting there not feeling that well. To that point then, Panda Girl 311 on YouTube, this is what she asked. Do you think the virus will eventually spread to Canada?
The answer is probably yes. Okay, so we can't stop coming here, so the flights are continuing to come here. We do have screening here, some of the cameras and all that stuff for fever. The problem is if you don't have a fever, then it's not going to pick you up. So therefore, if you're in that window where you're not that sick, you're going to bring the virus here. The good news is that because there's so much media coverage. You and I have talked about this, and this has been on the forefront. Anybody that's coming in from China, I'm worried about them, right? Like, so if my friend is coming from China, I'm going to say, hey, stay at home, okay?
Yeah.
Don't come out, don't go into a big train. So if we take care of those people that are flying in, then we should not have a big pandemic here again. SARS was different. We didn't know. People landed and then they went home and they did all this stuff. And when they got sick, we didn't know. And so therefore they were able to spread to so many people. Whereas this time we're getting fair warning. Time zero right now. In other words, we have no cases and we can protect ourselves by monitoring these people. You and I. In other words, you monitor your family, your friends, and make sure that if they get sick, they get it treated.
Well, over died because of SARS back in 2003. How are we better prepared now than we were back then?
Yeah, so SARS was 800 people that died, and then here it's 41, so we're sort of growing at the moment. And so the good news is that we now have a test. So back then we didn't even have a test for SARS. We didn't know what this mystery virus was that was killing people. So for a long period of time we couldn't identify it. Whereas now we have a test to identify it. We can track where it's going. We know that it's going to come in on an airplane of some sort from that region. So therefore we can keep a close eye on these people. You and I know that any family member that comes from there, we're going to keep a close eye on them. So the knowledge base has increased quite dramatically. And China has been quite forthcoming up until the numbers. I think the numbers are kind of a little bit off right now. Now forthcoming in terms of there's a virus, here we've genetically coded it and this is the test, so they've been good with that. And now we all know to watch out for the boogeyman, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so therefore we're much further ahead than SARS. So I don't think we should have another situation like SARS here in Canada.
Okay, so further ahead than we were with SARS, but if the People's Republic is not being upfront about the numbers. Yes, they are telling the world that this coronavirus exists, but if they're not upfront about the numbers, how significant is that?
So the good thing is that because it's been spread to other countries, everybody's on alert. The worry is if they're not upfront about the numbers and nobody's paying attention, right? So nobody was worried about this, that becomes a problem. Now everybody's worried about it. So now even if the numbers are off, let's say by 1,000, okay, doesn't matter because that plane that comes into Toronto will still get checked and the people will still know to take care of themselves. We will still know to report them and get them to healthcare if they begin to get sick. So in other words, we're all aware now. And so that's what makes it very different than the early days of SARS, where really we didn't have any clue that this virus was coming through.
On Twitter wants to know about the frontline workers that, for example, work in a hospital. What are the steps being taken to well-equipped frontline nurses and other healthcare providers?
So for SARS, we had nothing because we didn't know what was going on. So therefore, the precautions weren't really that great. Nowadays, as soon as they trigger this in, there's a respiratory precaution protocol. So all the hospitals, everybody, they do drills and stuff like that. So therefore, that's very good. My only concern is lack of equipment. So in China, because they weren't expecting this, there may be lack of masks and things like that, and maybe lack of people, right, manpower that could actually look after these people. Because it's a different story when the hospital is running normally versus now you got 1,000 people waiting outside saying that they're all coughing and they're worried that they have this thing. And so that's the real concern that we have. So the first frontline workers know what to do, but we might be bringing in healthcare workers that might, so they might not be as experienced. We might be running out of equipment and we might be running out of those tests, which means that we can't figure out which patient is one of these bad ones and which one is just a cold.
Is it too early to talk about a vaccine?
You know what? We always talked about vaccines. In the SARS, we still don't have a SARS vaccine. And that's because SARS was so violent that eventually it burns itself out. It has no more hosts to go after. And as soon as we locked it down, there has been no SARS since. So the thought is, why do we need a vaccine anymore, right? Because vaccine takes time to develop. Now I think China, as well as the World Health Organization, are saying maybe we should make a vaccine against the coronavirus family. In other words, instead of waiting for a SARS or a MERS or a Wuhan virus, why don't we make something that grabs a hold of these things, trains our body to say, if you see these spikes coming through, take those guys out, because now there's talk of, because it has this worldwide implication, both in health and economics, that maybe it's worthwhile to make these vaccines that is more universal, as opposed to waiting for another one to come from some snake going across to a human. The other thing that we need to do is get rid of that contact. So imagine if we didn't have that close contact with the live animals, we can't get it across. The virus will not go.
Okay, listen, I want to end this as we began it with another video clip. One last question, and this goes to prevention as well as precautions. Take a listen.
How easily it is to get caught, what kind of things I can do to prevent it, what kind of steps I need to do if it does happen, stuff like that, and all the precautions.
Good. That's good. That's a good thing to end up on. So number one, the virus can't move. It actually needs us. So sneezy people, you're going to stay away from. Turn away if you're sitting next to them and they're sneezing, turn the other way and breathe the other air. Masks may be helpful to stop your hands from touching your face, but the key is not to touch your hands to your face, because the virus will need to get to your lungs. Washing your hands before you touch your face is a good idea. Washing it all the time is difficult for people. And then the coughing in the elbow, I would say just cough into Kleenex and get rid of that. And if you're sick, don't go into work, don't go into public transport, those kinds of things. And also tell the facility ahead of time that you're coming in so they can take precautions. And if we do that, we don't have to have this pandemic and scare that everybody is talking about. We will be able to contain this very nicely.
Okay, very quickly, one last one I'm squeezing in here from Alice Jen. Are hand sanitizers effective enough?
They are. Hand sanitizers are good. 20 seconds of just washing with soap is good. And remember, the virus cannot go through skin, and as soon as you wash it off, it's gone.
Okay, well, you know, high five. Dr. Peter Lin, thank you for that. Dr. Peter Lin, our regular medical contributor right here on CBC News. Stay with us. Our coverage continues on CBC News Network. And for those that joined on our social media, thank you.